Galahad, acknowledge. This is command.
I read you, Percival.
Enjoying a stroll in the park, are we?
Nothing quite like a chilly London morning to stimulate the senses.
So yeah, Andrea, you and I are both the first ones at GT to have actually finished the order. You actually got through it before I did because I was kind of busy over the weekend, and Monday being a holiday kind of saved me. And the word you wrote in your email when you first beat it was conflicted.
Yes.
And I think that's a really good word for where we stand.
Yeah, so it sucks because we both, I think, came into this, as a lot of people out there did, with really high hopes for this game. It kind of being the flagship PlayStation exclusive game for the PS4 in this new generation. Really the first one that gamers were like, this is a new IP, it's gonna really harness the power of next gen and really show us something awesome. And it did. It didn't disappoint in that way, but for me, the reason why I said conflicted is because while it was visually absolutely stunning, something we have not yet seen before, it fell short in so many ways that was so disappointing.
Yeah, and I think the weird thing for me is there's nothing in the game that I can look at and say, oh, well, this is just bad. Like, everything is kind of just adequate. It's like the shooting, it could be better, but it's not terrible. And it's enjoyable all the way through. But it's just like there's no way to really branch out. There's no reason to really feel like you're going to replay the game or anything.
I do think there is a bad thing in the game, but before we get to the bad, I do want to kind of say what I really loved about the game. While I agree that a lot of the mechanical parts of the game, the actual mechanics of them, were very average and stuff that we have seen before, very shooting gallery-like in the third-person shooter cover genre, I mean, something that we've seen plenty of times. The stealth sequences are something we've seen, done plenty of times. QuickTime events we've also seen a lot. What I really enjoyed, though, was the mix of all of those different elements together, how each chapter kind of brought a different experience to the table, and some chapters were literally just cinematics. It's just storytelling in specific chapters. And I liked how when I began a new chapter, I didn't know how long that chapter was going to be. I didn't know what I was going to be doing in that chapter. I mean, that to me was one of the more exciting parts about playing this game, and what really kept me playing all the way through and had me not wanting to put the controller down, because I don't know what's going to happen next. I need to find out. But the bad thing about it was that it ended so abruptly. I'm going to try to stay away from spoilers as much as possible, but we're probably going to have to talk about a few spoilers in this video. So if you guys want a completely untouched experience, just be aware that there will be some minor spoilers here and there. But the bad thing that I think that this game did was having those automatic fail QuickTime events in some of the story elements. So, for example, during some of the Lycan fights, there was these QuickTime events that if you didn't nail it perfectly, it was auto-fail. Same with some of the stealth sections. If you didn't, execute your stealth kill perfectly, it was auto-fail, and then you would have to go back to the beginning of that particular section. That to me is like, what? I don't understand why that's even a mechanic that exists. Like, why auto-fail?
Yeah, and it kind of ruins that cinematic nature of it as well, because now you're watching the same thing over again in some instances. I didn't have too many of those because I think I was, from the preview builds, I was ready for, QuickTime thing could happen at any moment. But there were definitely some, like at the beginning with the arc gun and where the Lycan could attack Isabel. And it's like, oh, I was supposed to be running and chasing this thing through the streets. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that Ready at Dawn did a fantastic job of building out this alternate history of London and creating the Order and really giving these people characters. But I think they did such a fantastic job that's why I was so disappointed and upset that they didn't finish the job. I felt like they introduced me to this cast of characters that I was really intrigued to get to know. Like, I wanted to learn more about the Marquis's background. I wanted to learn how Izzy joined the Order and, what the relationship is between Galahad and these two characters and, why Percival and Galahad had this deep connection, this brotherhood, if you will. And that's to me where I think Ready at Dawn misstepped is that they spent so much time kind of setting up like the basics that they didn't fill in enough of the smaller details to really make it a robust enough storytelling experience, especially when storytelling was such a focal point of the game overall.
Yeah, I did kind of mention that in the review too. I felt the some of the character development wasn't like all the way there. You know, like you got this hint that there was more of a relationship between Isabel and Galahad, but then you didn't really see that fleshed out very well. And then I also got the sense that you don't really get the idea that they've known each other for decades or hundreds of years. You know, it's kind of hard to gauge like how long each person has known each other, and that level of trust just seems to like evaporate when something weird starts happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing that I thought was interesting when I first began the game. There was no like VO narrative describing how the Order formed and what their history is. There was no like on-screen text like you see sometimes at the beginning of games explaining like basic history. And that's something that I feel like the game could have definitely benefited from. I mean, I appreciate that they were trying to give the player the benefit of the doubt that they could figure out the story on their own. But sometimes when you're, especially with a new IP, with a new setting like this and new characters that we haven't met before, it's necessary to set up some of those stuff for the completion of the narrative. And that's where I think was one of many areas where they could have done better. But I will say, as generic as the shooting sections of the game felt, they still were really fun. And I don't know if that's just because I like the diversity of guns that they had, and I like the way that you could move in and out of cover, but they did feel very shooting gallery-like, but that didn't stop me from enjoying them. How did you feel about it?
Yeah, I think that's what I meant when I was talking about the mechanics being like adequate, but maybe not at the highest level, because I never had a point where I was like so bored or so frustrated with the gunplay. I definitely experimented with the different types of pistols and rifles they had, which they did have a fair amount of variation on just your normal everyday weapons. The one I think bane of everyone's existence will be the shotgunners that just run up behind you while you're trying to snipe.
They're so bad, but I will say it felt nice that the AI was as heavily powered as I was. Like those shotguns, certain types of the shotguns were one-hit kills, as a shotgun should be. And in some games, the AI can't take you down with a single shot, but you can take them down. I liked the challenge of, I say liked. I was angrily frustrated. I had to replay a couple sections several times before I figured out, how to approach it differently. But I think it's good when they make it sections challenging enough that you care about it, right? Because if it's so mediocre all the way through and you don't have an opinion, or you could just be like, oh, whatever about it, that to me means that they failed, in that regard as well.
Yeah, and I remember there's another section I had trouble with where I was going up, there's some snipers in the window, and I was just trying to figure out, like, okay, where's my opportunity to actually, get back at them? It was like every time I pop out, like they'd hit me.
Yeah, there was that one section with the guy that had the rocket launcher that just kicked my ass. I think I played through that section like 15 times before I was like, oh yeah, I should use my black sight.
Oh wow! Yeah, I think I got taken out by him once, and then I just kind of went up there, and then had the Galahad go into rage mode.
Nice.
But yeah, I think what was interesting going back to the story a bit is I actually did appreciate that they didn't go too deep into the lore, but I felt like when they got to the end, I didn't even realize I was at the end. I didn't feel like that buildup was really there yet. It just sort of like, this thing happened, and then there's credits. I'm like, what? But what about that guy? And what about what he said to him? And what about Igraine and all of this? And it was just, and I think that's probably the biggest misstep, because I think people would have been probably less harsh in other reviews if the story had really paid off, and instead it left you hanging in a way that wasn't even a cliffhanger. It was just like, oh, it's over.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there was absolutely no payoff in the story. It almost felt like they were setting it up to talk about, the next step in like the next installment, which to me seems I don't know if egotistical is the right word, but like assuming that your audience is going to want to come back and find out what happens with these characters is something that when you're making a AAA, shooter console experience, it's something you just can't count on with the first installment in a new franchise. And I think that they certainly had plenty of time to expand on the story and add a few more chapters so we could see, what happens with some of these key characters and these key plot points at the end of the game. Generally, when you're talking about any kind of medium, whether it be television or movies or books or video games, the idea of you want to leave them wanting more is always a good thing, right? You feel like you've succeeded if you've hooked them and they're like, oh, I can't get enough. But in this case, I think they just left so many loose ends. You ended with so many more questions than you began with. And that to me felt very unsatisfying. I mean, granted, if they put out the second installment next year, I would absolutely buy it and play it because it hooked me enough and I had a good enough experience that I want to see it more. But that's not the case for the general video game purchasing audience that has a limited amount of money to spend on a certain amount of games each year, especially in a year like 2015 where there's huge blockbusters slated to come out this year and you have to pick and choose what you can play and what you can't play. Speaking of the story, I know this might seem like a pivot or like a diversion, but one of the things that I think maybe could have helped them answer some more of those questions and maybe not left the audience, with so many like, well, what's happening to that person moment, were these little things that you picked up in the world, whether it be a photograph that you look at, or the newspaper, or a note. There were several paper items that you would pick up in the world, which looked beautiful, and you could flip them over and look at the back. But after you set them down, there literally was no way to go back and look at them again. And that to me was a big mistake because adding collectibles to a game adds a lot of replayability. If I had known, hey, there are 5 pieces of intel that you need to pick up in this chapter, I probably would have spent a lot more time exploring and looking for those pieces of intel. Instead, I picked up what I saw, because there was no loot system per se in this game, so there's no motivation to go explore every single inch of the world. So that to me was just one of many missteps, and I wanted to learn more. I wanted to hear more about Charles Darwin and what he was doing and what Tesla was doing, and hear about the banter back and forth between like Tesla and Edison. Like some of that stuff was really interesting and really kind of exciting, and I feel like they didn't do enough to really draw in some of those additional plot points, which is something that we've been saying over and over again. But I want to ask you, I know we're talking a lot here. A lot of people have rated this game really low. I personally think that you did a perfect job on this review. You and I see really eye to eye, but obviously a lot of other people don't agree. But I want to ask, do you think that that's indicative of people having too many expectations that aren't being met, or that the game just really was that bad?
I think one of the things I struggle with is, at what point do I look at this game and see, what I want from it, and also it's like, do I judge it too harshly for, things that it's just not another game, right? It's like so I think that's kind of where some of that balance to me was coming through. Is it's like, okay, this is going to be a cinematic linear experience. And yes, there were things that it could have done better, but at the same time, I really enjoyed that experience. It just kind of left me kind of cut off at the end. And if everything had been at the same level as the visuals, because I think the visuals and the craftsmanship and just the world and the lore and everything put together and making you feel like you're in that place. If everything had been at level, we would be looking at a Game of the Year contender. But since it's not, it's just kind of like, okay, well, here's a good way to spend a Saturday.
Yeah, you're not wrong. That's definitely true. I think a lot of us went in with really high hopes and feel a little let down. But I said this on Twitter, and I'll say it again: it's 100% absolute worth your time to play this game, to experience it, and to see how amazing Ready at Dawn did with the visuals and creating the world. So. I loved it. I mean, loved is a strong word. I liked it a lot.
Great. Well, thanks for chatting, and yeah, I definitely am interested in seeing what the players actually get to think of it when they get to check it out.
Do you trust anyone, mon général?
Never accept, always question. It's a motto that's seen me through the centuries.